Good morning, everyone. Jim McDermott here, technical agronomist with DEKALB and Asgrow, and also glad to have my counterpart, Dustin.
Yep. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, and we've got Nora Schultz was also going to join us. She is on the road, so may or may not be able to chime in, but glad to have a good group. Got a nice number to start off with, and we know more will be joining as we go through our slides. A lot of fun topics, or at least I think they're fun. I'll start with a trivia question, cover a little bit on GDUs. Also hit on the GDUs as far as from January 1st relating to rootworm. Still talking a little bit about replants. Had some hail last Monday in a few pockets. So we'll hit on that topic. Also, this is the time of the year where, boy, Dustin, our nutrient demand is going up, and so that means nutrient deficiencies are starting to show. A lot of other interesting things going on too. Herbicide carryover, always kind of intriguing when stand can come up, look good, and then suddenly some cases go backwards once it gets into that herbicide zone. So a lot of times that shows up well after emergence, and that's some of what we're seeing today. Starting to get into that time of the year where Delaro Complete spraying is coming on. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll be getting out some of our information on hybrid by fungicide response. Finish up with the Spotlight product. And then, of course, on the last slide, we will have our QR code for the half credit in crop management. So welcome, everybody, and start off with our trivia question. And it's actually a picture. So hopefully, if you're at least in front of your computer or in front of your iPad, you're able to see the picture. So what are we looking at? Right there. Got a corn plant, looks kind of funky. First one to put an answer in the chat. And I haven't checked if Scott O'Connell is on, but boy, he's been our defending champion the last 2 times.
Nobody's got a quick trigger this morning, it doesn't look like, Jim.
So we got a really funny looking white corn plant. One hint is it's all by itself. It is the only one in the field.
Either they're quiet or you stumped them, Jim.
Give it a little time. Jeff Blywett has got it. Got it.
There you go. That's a good one.
I like Dustin Hogadorn's answer too. Have to give him some sort of consolation prize, but yeah, Jeff's got it first. So a genetic mutation, one of those things that comes up this time of the year when you're walking a field and you see one plant that sticks out, and this is probably the most common form of the genetic mutation we see, where this one happens to be lack of chloroplast or chlorophyll. And of course, just turns it a white color. Sometimes you can have some of that genetic striping where you've got very distinct white and green stripes. Also, you tend to see some of the genetic mutations show up later in the season as disease lesion mimic. That's one that'll catch people off guard. And that's usually an isolated plant too, but sometimes it'll be even more than one plant. It tends to look a lot like a disease. One of the disease lesion mimics looks a lot like eye spot. So that'll usually trigger a few questions later in the season. But genetic mutations, so Jeff, I'll get you down as a prize winner. And we will jump into the rest of our presentation here. As long as we can keep admitting people into the lobby. They're coming.
Yeah, you're taking the lead on the first couple slides. I'll get everybody admitted.
Fast and furious, yeah. It's not easy to get in. Kind of reminds me of the old joke, why are the gates to the cemetery always locked? People are dying to get in, of course. All right. Hold your laughter. GDU accumulation. So, it's been interesting to track this. Of course, we had been running well ahead of schedule with all that early heat, and we've just been slowly losing ground. Pulled Calhoun County, and this was as of this morning, but really across the board on planting dates, going from the 11th of April to the 3rd of May. Pretty similar as far as the amount that we're behind, but between 32 and 47 GDUs behind the long-term average. Not a big deal. Some of these warm days we can accumulate between 25 and 28 GDUs. So in the terms of days, talking between 1 and 2 days. And again, like we've mentioned before, we've just had a high percent of our corn and soybeans on earlier planting dates this year. So, the planting dates alone are helping us out just as far as the percent of corn that's, far along or at a good growth stage at this point of the season. Just looking at some early projections, it's, we still have some of this early planted corn that should be, as long as the trend continues, tasseling for sure by the 10th of July, and in some cases slightly before then. So it'll be interesting to see if we can get some by the 4th of July, which, boy, that's less than 4 weeks away. But this corn will change drastically and already has been. So jumping into some current topics. Hail damage, and it hasn't been terribly widespread, but for those that were affected, of course, it's very severe. Pockets from last Monday's storm, especially in Sioux County, were hit pretty hard. You see, looking at some of the corn here, a lot of this corn was at V5 to V6, probably not much in V7, but of course that growing point in most cases was still either below the ground or right at the surface. Some of these plants like this one, where it actually did snap off, those are going to have a hard time coming back, especially if it was V6 or bigger. From what I've seen as far as the recovery, it generally has looked good on corn. Of course, a lot of it's been uneven, but as I've split these growing points, most everything is still healthy and white. Even after some of the sun and wind we've had, there's still some of the whorls that are tied up and of course just delaying the ability for that plant to take off. But for the most part, seen very little corn that's need replanted. Beans, on the other hand, a fair amount of beans are being replanted. Some of these were down to a stick. It's interesting though. This is actually a picture from last year from a hailstorm that hit hard right around 22nd or just before the 22nd of May. And this plant is flagged. Got the metal flag sticking right there. And, the rule of thumb on beans is, you need at least one cotyledon or one full leaf to really say that it's got enough energy to get that regrowth going. In this case, that was probably marginal, maybe a half a cotyledon there. But then here, about 2.5 weeks later, you can see the regrowth on this plant. And that's what I was seeing. Did a hail meeting in northwest of Hull on Friday, and that was just about long enough. You really were starting to see a lot of the regrowth, and of course from those axillary buds, and sometimes even from the growing point at the top, the regrowth looked pretty good. Still was a little bit slow just because of the fact we hadn't had a lot of sun and heat at that point, but fair amount of soybean fields are still in the recovery phase and the evaluation phase. Of course, those guidelines, continue to tick down for corn, be it hail or for other reasons. Again, depend on a lot of situations, but as a starting point, I would be using about a 17, 18,000 threshold for replanting on corn. So hopefully not too many at that level. It always seems like there's a few fields that get caught when the sprayer comes through for the first time, spray and post emerge, but hopefully anything that was a tough stand has been caught by now. And then on the soybeans, certainly also field by field situation. I'd still be about that 75 to 80,000 threshold for replanting, which is similar to threshold that really I've been using the last few weeks. hopefully we're past that and don't have any nasty storms, Dustin.
Yeah, I know. It
Few days.
makes you nervous, how warm we're going to get today, and they're calling for some maybe things. But this crop looks too good. We don't need that to happen right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, yield potential on soybeans, if they are still going out, we're at that point where it does seem to drop off pretty quickly. We all know we can still have some good beans in mid-May or mid-June planting, but by the chart, going from early June to mid-June is really when you start seeing that reduction, and not only reduction in yield potential, but also in the amount of canopy. So jump into some other things that are going on some of our cornfields that didn't get hailed on, Dustin.
Yep. Yeah. So gotten a few calls the last couple days, and it has shown up for several years now, and sulfur deficiency, and you'll get this interveinal striping. And, as I look at it, we're not getting as much sulfur from, rainfall free sulfur anymore. And along with that, we keep driving these yields higher and higher. And I know we're applying a lot of sulfur. There's a lot of ways to get sulfur on our crops, but at the end of the day, with our yield potentials, I still don't think we're putting enough on. I mean, really the removal rate for sulfur, you're at about 0.1 pounds per bushel. So, you're pushing 300 bushel, you need 30 pounds. And I just ran into it again, and we've ran into it for several years.
Good morning. How are you? Doing all right. How are you?
As we're
not that good. What's the matter? My good leg. Hurt my good leg now.
Using
phosphorus
to Micro Essentials or MAP MST as our phosphorus source. Obviously, those two products contain sulfur. And then I know last year, as phosphorus prices were really high, we were reducing rates or not putting minimums in. So not putting phosphorus on high testing soils. And when we do that, you're not applying sulfur either. And I ran into a field just yesterday afternoon coming back into Spencer that you have areas in the field that are showing sulfur deficiencies, and it's all blotchy. And at first, it's no rhyme or reason of why is this area of the field striped up and these other areas are not. And if you would overlay that field with your variable rate map, it's right where we didn't apply phosphorus last fall. So just keep in mind, I know over the last several years working with growers, if you're going to variable rate a product like Micro Essentials or MAP MST and not force minimums, we need to make sure when we come back in the spring that we're putting ATS on to get a consistent sulfur rate across that field, or you're going to get splotchy fields and you're going to wonder what's going on. But if you would look at your variable rate map from the fall, it'll match up perfectly. We've ran into lots of fields like this over the last 5 to 6 years, but I think the biggest thing going forward is I don't know if we're applying enough sulfur on these fields. And here's the uptake curve that Belo did out of Illinois. And as you look, you need season long availability of sulfur as well. So, you get out to VT, you're still needing 30-40% of your sulfur needs for that corn crop post acid. So you need season long availability. And I like putting on multiple forms to keep that available to the plant all year long. Mm-hmm. Anything to add there, Jim?
A lot of good points. Some years you see this in some other deficiencies and you think, well, it's temporary, or maybe it's just a slow root growth, or maybe, lack of soil temperatures. We're not getting a lot of mineralization either for the sulfur or for nitrogen. This year, I don't think that's really the case. We've had pretty good soil temperatures, good moisture, but not excessive moisture. And overall, I think our root growth is good for this time of the year. So I don't think we can say, boy, it's the sidewall compaction or something that's limiting these roots or too saturated a soil. So I think our root growth is there, so it should be able to access. So if we're truly seeing these nutrient deficiency symptoms, it's probably pointing to the fact that we don't have enough, and we're starting to potentially cut into yield, knowing that we're forming our rows around and that we're getting into a rapid uptake phase, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the next one, these are a couple pictures. The one on the far right is the one I actually took yesterday or a couple days ago. And then these others are actually from a couple years ago. And, as you look at sulfur or any interveinal striping at this time of year, it could be a multitude of different micronutrients. All micronutrient deficiencies are going to show up at the top of the plant. And, it could be sulfur, it could be zinc, manganese, kind of exhibit similar deficiency symptoms. But a lot of times when you're dealing with a zinc deficiency, you'll get more of this white band, like you see in these pictures. And these ones on the left was this grower was having issues in this field, just continuing to expand year over year and get bigger and bigger. And as we went out there and pulled tissue samples and zinc soil tests, it was about as low as we had ever seen. So, I always go off like the hierarchy of needs. We need to get NP and K right when we're talking about fertility programs, and then sulfur, and then kind of zinc, and then boron. It goes down the list. But again, as we're driving yields higher and higher, we need to look more at some of these secondary and micronutrients to push crop yields.
Well, absolutely. If we're dealing in 180, 190 bushel yield environment, there's something else that's probably the more limiting factor. But if we're 240, 250 and higher, then these factors really start to limit us on that top end or that ceiling, especially if that deficiency symptom shows for, a week, 10 days or longer, then we know we're cutting into our yield. So as far as zinc, Dustin, have you had much luck as far as some of the in-season applications?
I've had some luck, obviously. There's a lot of talk around, foliar nutrition, and sometimes guys and growers are looking for silver bullets, but, just applying foliar nutrition haphazardly without knowing what that yield limiting factor is, it's as long as, you have the other yield limiting factors covered, we can see some pretty nice increases in doing some foliar products. But I always go back to, you need to start with A, B, and C and get the basic fundamentals down before we start looking at different applications. But the way this crop looks right now, and we should treat it accordingly. But I think the biggest thing, especially as you get over into your area, Jim, as we look at, possibly some zinc deficiencies, as you get really, really high phosphorus levels, especially in Sioux County, where you got phosphorus levels over 100 parts per million. As you get into those really high phosphorus levels, you can induce a zinc deficiency. So it's something to look at for those guys over there as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then along with that, of course, is it's kind of like plant pathologists are always going to talk the disease triangle. When you're talking nutrients, you have to bring in the pH availability, and especially on something like zinc, at the extreme acidic side, you do see a limitation, but you really have to be below that 5.0 pH. But more so on the upper end, if you're, even at 7.5, you're starting to limit your overall availability on zinc, and not as drastic as what we have with iron. Of course, we see that in our soybean crop with IDC, but zinc, we know once we get to that high pH, then we're going to start limiting that overall uptake. All right, jumping into a few other things that are going on for current topics right now, Dustin.
Yeah, so getting a few calls this week and the end of last week of, my beans are getting yellow. And obviously you see these pictures, and you need to take into consideration where it's lying in the field too. Because as we work east in the Clarion, Nicollet, Webster soils, we have high pH, and some of these can get misdiagnosed for, IDC starting to show up in the beans. But these pictures that we show here are not in high pH areas. And then we look into, you get this chlorosis, yellowing of the leaves, bleaching out. And what we're looking at here is, HPPD carryover, our group 27s, our products that we've relied heavily on in corn. And then, at first it's like, I can't believe we're getting herbicide carryover in these beans with all the rainfall we had last year. You just would have thought there's no way we're going to have any herbicide carryover. But as we pull in and look at, the rainfall from July 1st through the 9th, anywhere in Northwest Iowa, we're, 6 to 9.5 inches below normal precip. So you take that into account. We had a really, really dry summer. And along with that, we have all of these chemistry programs anymore. We keep bumping rates. We're either putting some of these group 27s in with our pre, following back with a post application of a group 27. So we're starting to get rates up there pretty high, along with, in certain areas last year, we had late planting. We had some June planted corn in Dickinson County. And along with that, we had rain trying to get post applications done. So we had some late post applications as well. So a combination of higher rates, later applications, and lack of rainfall in the summer. We're starting to see, and then on top of that, we planted beans really early this spring. So there's a combination of 4 or 5 different factors that is driving us to see some symptomology of group 27 carryovers. Just putting out here too of, the persistence in the soil of some of these herbicides, 8 months for Lotus, 9 months for Impact, and 10 months for Callisto are the plant rotation restrictions back to soybeans. So it's always, when you run into that, kind of look at the rates applied by that grower, when they were applied, and kind of how early they planted those beans. So
yeah, I hit the nail on the head. We saw it 2 years ago, especially as far as HPPD carryovers. And then I think this year, as we had these beans, in the ground early, they took a while to come up and they seemed to stall out, again, with some of the cooler, cloudy weather that we've been having. Those beans were not able to grow through some of that herbicide carryover. Just a function of how quickly can you get through that zone. But once they stalled out, I think they were sitting there struggling, and some of the other, be it herbicide carryover or be it IDC, some of the other factors were kicking in. But yeah, seems like it's been out there again. Maybe not quite as widespread as 2 years ago, but still something to be aware of. But all right, we'll keep moving here. I know we're starting to run up against time. Just another touch point on the rootworm, knowing that from January 1st, once we get to 684, we are getting into that 50% hatch, and we're certainly there. Just as updated as yesterday, some of the locations, this would be Newell, so 766, get down towards central Iowa. A lot of them well into the 700s, if not 800s. And then even as we go north, 649, 652 in north central Iowa. So certainly at the point where rootworm activity is out there. I have heard of at least one report of lightning bug. I believe that was Sac County over the weekend. I haven't seen any myself, but we know we've got the GDUs that they should be showing up. So definitely the time of the year when we want to have a shovel with us when we're going into any cornfield and be looking at not only the health of our roots, but start to see if we're finding anything for scraping, scarring on those roots. Larvae are always going to be tough to see early on, but the scraping or the scarring is always the first thing to look for. And we'll see how it plays out. Looks like we're in a fairly dry pattern, fairly dry period for this hatch to happen. So usually that means a little higher survival with our rootworm larvae. And again, if you're interested in getting some of the sticky traps, just some of the how-to guides as far as evaluating rootworm pressure, I have some sticky traps myself. I can get more, so I know we can certainly provide as many sticky traps as you need. Always a good way to keep close to that customer and monitor what's going on out there. Appreciate the chat comment from David Simonson. Saw lightning bugs in Boone Saturday night, so there we go. That time of the year. All right, a few other things going on. We've been talking about, we've had some accelerated growth showing out there. Of course, when we get some of that wrapping, this particular case, it's not AGS. This would be from dicamba. So this was a field that was sprayed with a safened formulation of dicamba, but was sprayed during a very warm, humid period last weekend, I believe. So this had some pretty good activity, not only on the weeds, but also on the corn. With these safened formulations of dicamba, feel pretty good about the regrowth and being able to come out of it fairly well. But this can be shocking when you see some of the amount of floppy leaning corn like this. Something we tend to see every year, but this year I think there's been a little bit more of it so far. This is just a field that had a relatively early application of Diflex. Corn was V3 to V4 when it was sprayed, actually on the 14th of May. You can see the progression, and that picture on the left that on the 21st of May doesn't quite do it justice. There was some pretty tightly wrapped whorls, some that were laid over, maybe not as much as the previous picture, but some corn plants that you look at and you're a little bit shocked with. And of course, a lot of the speckling just from some of the surfactant burn, but just followed really going back into the same spot of the field, the progression of how it looked about 10 days later. And then again yesterday, really looks beautiful. V7 corn for the most part, almost getting to V8, and it's been able to progress through some of that Diflex wrapping very, very nicely. So normally what we see, but it's always nice to kind of follow that progression. How about for you, Dustin? As far as some of the post-emerge on corn, you seeing anything that's concerning to you or anything that sticks out?
No, I think the biggest thing, and we had in the newsletter as well, is just the evaluation of these herbicide programs. We spend a lot of time developing plans through the winter and prepay time, and just make sure we're having good, effective weed control. And then if we do need to make a rescue treatment, we really need to watch these labels because we're probably going to a growth regulator, and let's just make sure we're not causing a big problem. So.
Yeah. So far what I've seen, and mostly it's been the Diflexes or the growth regulators on corn, and it has looked good. You don't necessarily see that blown away fried weed, but the activity has been quick, and they've looked like the water hemp have been twisted up pretty darn effectively overall from what I've seen. A couple things to wrap up on. One is getting into that time of the year. So we've had our first disease risk maps come out. This one going back to June 1st. But based on environment and then as we get into the season, this also is based on, what actually is showing up, when people scout and are able to report the evidence of disease. But even into almost central Iowa, we've seen the tar spot risk move into the moderate category, which is a little bit early as compared to most years. And these are models. They're never perfect. And I bring up the example of the disease risk map on southern rust last year. For a lot of the season, it was showing in either the low or even the very low category. Once we got into late July and August, it did get into the moderate category, but never really got past that. And we all know, most of our areas that southern rust was in the high category, especially late season. These disease risks maps generally go till the end of August, and we still had a lot of blow up both on tar spot and southern rust even after that date. So something to be aware of. They're a good model, can help you evaluate what type of risk, but they're never perfect like any model. But we'll have the links to these in our newsletter coming up as well, and we'll have them in these slides. So last thing here before we close out is a Spotlight product, a product that was introduced a year ago, 10414 Smart Stacks Pro at 104 day. One of those agronomic solid products, a very good disease tolerance, very good roots, so it can handle poorly drained soil, and very good overall agronomics for standability. Saw it be a little slower as far as overall emergence this year, so something to be aware of. Probably not one we're going to want to stick out there first if we're in a cool, heavy soil, but really like this one for the stability, stress tolerance, tougher acre, and just the overall agronomics. A nice addition to the lineup to complement the 10533 as a Smart Stacks Pro, and then we'll also have the new 10363 coming in as another Smart Stacks Pro at 103 day. With that, we've gotten to that last key slide, Dustin.
That's right. Everybody was waiting for.
But glad to have everyone on board this morning. If there's any questions that you want to come off mute and ask or put in the chat, certainly stick around here for another minute. But always glad to have everyone. QR code on the left side, and then the upper right is the QR code for signing up for the agronomic newsletters that come out on but roughly a bi-weekly basis. Anything else to add, Dustin, from your side?
No, I just hit, you mentioned that 10414 being a little slow. Walked a lot of plots yesterday. On bean stubble, it looked pretty good from what I seen. And, my start in this role, where I seen it challenged was early April planted corn on corn. The plants were there. They were a little off, but it was more plant to plant variability. But it was in a tough environment as well for emergence. But on bean stubble, it seemed to perform pretty well.
Yeah. I'd say it really seemed like the stand was there. I would agree, and it just seemed like the unevenness, especially if you're evaluating a field or a plot right at emergence. Once you got to V1, V2, then things started to straighten out and even up more so. But yeah, I really like what that thing can do for yield and agronomics. All right, well, we are past time. So again, thanks everyone for being on.
Thank you guys.
Enjoy the day, and hopefully everybody stays safe.